Hello, alumni and friends. Welcome to today's conversation about Emotion AI and Girl Decoded, a scientist's quest to reclaim our humanity by bringing emotional intelligence to technology, with author Rana Kaliouby and her Cambridge advisor and professor of computer technology, Professor Peter Robinson. On behalf of Cambridge in America, I hope you are all safe and well in these unusual times. We are glad you are joining us today. As you may know, Cambridge in America is the outpost in North America for the colleges and the university, handling alumni engagement, events, and fundraising. Part of our role is to help you connect with the university and your colleges as well as with each other. Today, we have over 270 alumni and friends registered for this event, tuning in from across the US and Canada. Welcome again to those just joining us. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Your microphone and camera will be turned off throughout. This session will have a Q&A following the presentation. You are welcome to submit Q&A questions throughout the talk using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Of course, our speakers will attempt to address as many questions as possible, but time is limited. We thank you in advance for your understanding if your question is not answered. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the Cambridge in America YouTube channel. There is no question that we will all enjoy the coming hour with author and alumna of Newnham College, Rana Kaliouby, and it is the pleasure of Cambridge in America to welcome to the screen Peter Robinson, Professor of Computer Technology in the Department of Computer Science and Technology, and Fellow of Gonville and Keys College, to introduce today's speaker. Please welcome Professor Peter Robinson.
Hi, and thank you very much for the invitation and the welcome. It's great to be with you. Late evening in a dark and cold October evening here in Cambridge, but it's good to see some bright young faces. Cambridge has a long history in computing. The department was founded in 1937, and we built what we like to describe as the world's first practical electronic stored program computer in 1949, the work of Maurice Wilkes in particular and David Wheeler. And they were great publicists, and they wrote books too, and they ran summer schools from 1950. And in fact, my father attended one in 1951, and I actually have here the course textbook, which was the book that Maurice Wilkes and David Wheeler had written with Stanley Gill, one of their colleagues, called the Preparation of Programs for the Electronic Digital Computer. Well, I was born about a year after my father came on the course, so I guess computing has been in my genes, and Maurice Wilkes was still the head of department when I turned up there about 20 years later. Rana writes in her book about abusive thesis advisors who virtually enslave their doctoral students. Well, maybe. Actually, I've always thought the secret to academic success is to recruit very bright students, make sure that they have all the resources they need, keep out of their way for 3 years, and then claim the credit. So I've had some very bright students over the years, the inventor of the webcam, various founders of companies, and one of them was Rana. And I remember her application in particular because it was late. She applied in the middle of the summer of 2001, and she looked interesting, had a great career at the American University in Cairo, and we'd just received a couple of donations from benefactors, so I was able to offer her a place, and she duly turned up in Cambridge a couple of months later as a young, very bright, I was correct, Egyptian girl, interested in studying how we could use video to analyze people and understand their feelings. So Rana, are you lurking there somewhere for this conversation? It would be great if you could join in. There you are, yes.
I'm here.
Excellent.
I did not.
Lovely to
I
see
did
you
not
again.
write about an abusive PhD advisor.
I think I could quote you the line from your book, but maybe it wasn't me you were referring to.
I was not. You were amazing. And I'm very grateful to have been your student.
So what did it feel like when you arrived in Cambridge?
Well, so I arrived in Canada. You were right. My application was very late. I submitted it in August for a late September start. So I'm very grateful that we were able to make that happen. But I arrived a couple of weeks right after September 11th.
So.
And I don't know if you remember that, Peter, but when September 11th happened, I'm Muslim and I used to live in Cairo and I used to wear the hijab. So,
Okay.
so my parents, my family were very concerned about my safety and they asked if I could just study remotely. And I gave you a call and I said, hey, Peter, I have an incredible work ethic. Can I just do this from Cairo? And I'll visit every so often. And I remember you clearly saying, nope, because part of the experience is that you're in person and you cross-pollinate with everybody, at Cambridge, and you were absolutely right. So I showed up a few weeks later, and I had switched out my hijab for like a hat, and that was the beginning of it.
And you very rapidly got down to work. I should say that Rana has always been the very skilled networker, and very rapidly you established networks throughout Cambridge. And it has to be said, it's one of the good things about Cambridge as a university and a collegiate university. You get to meet people in all sorts of different disciplines. And of course, fairly soon you established a connection with the Autism Research Centre and Simon Baron-Cohen, who is of course a leader in the field. And that gave you some ideas for where the work was going, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember actually when I first got there, you encouraged me to give a talk to the computer lab, right? And just talk about my research. And I presented the challenge. I said I wanted to build a computer that can read people's expressions and emotions just the way humans do. And Rob Haig, one of your other PhD students, he was in the audience, and he said, you know, my brother has autism. You ought to look into that. And sure enough, it turns out Cambridge has one of the top autism research centers. And, you know, I mustered a lot of courage and emailed Simon Baron-Cohen, and he was very gracious, took the meeting. And it turns out he was developing a whole database, both visual and speech-based, to help kids on the autism spectrum read and understand these cues. And I think they had spent millions and millions of British pounds to make it happen. And we were able to leverage that data set.
Yeah, well, it was actually funded by a wonderful woman called Stephanie Shirley. Do you know this?
I do not
piece
know.
of research. Or Steve Shirley, Dame Stephanie Shirley, I should say, as she now is. She was one of the Kindertransport, so the Jewish children shipped out of Germany just before the Second World War, and she arrived in the UK and she was a great woman entrepreneur. I should introduce you to her sometime. But then, of course, she was just a young girl, studied maths, and decided that computing would be an interesting career to go into. And she worked for a while for various technology companies and eventually set up her own company. And realized she was getting nowhere when she pitched for business, when she signed the letters Stephanie Shirley. So she started signing them Steve Shirley, and the company grew and became, she ran a company called F International that employed only women programmers and actually had favorable terms for part-time work so they could take time out to care for families and so on. Enormously successful, but she had a son who was autistic. So she, when she sold the business, became a major philanthropist. And one of the projects she sponsored was Simon Baron-Cohen's work on the mind-reading DVD that you then used. So yes, there's an extra connection there, perhaps.
I did not know that story. I would love to connect with her, because also, if you recall, when I got to Cambridge, there were very few female PhD students at the time, and we started the Women at CL Club, if you like. And I think it's still going strong, right?
Oh, it's now a national initiative. Yes, so that's great. When you say there were very few, of course, there was my wife Carol, my late wife Carol, who was one of the first women PhDs out of Cambridge, who also, I have to say, after you had a very successful first year in the lab, I actually let you go back and work for the summer in Cairo, I seem to remember.
Right.
Which was sort of successful because I think Jana was born about 9 months later. So that was a mixed blessing. But when your mum couldn't go over, I seem to remember that Carol was also quite helpful to you, not just in advice on how to get a PhD out of the way, but also a bit about how to look after small children, of whom she had 3 by then.
Carol was instrumental in supporting my PhD, absolutely. And again, I don't know if you remember that, but when I found out, so I used to take the bus from where I lived to the computer lab, and one day I was just feeling really nauseous on the bus, and I begged the driver to just let me off. And I was like, something's weird here. And of course, it turns out I was pregnant. So I walked into your office and I was in tears, and you were like, what is wrong? And I was like, I think it's the end of my PhD. I have to go back home. And I was like, he said, what's wrong? And I said, no, I'm pregnant. And you were like, that's incredible. And I will never forget this. You were so supportive. You said, I'll support you either way. And of course I stuck with it. I had Jana in Cambridge, and I would schlep her along to the lab on many days.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think you may have been one of the first research students from whom we actually had to think about maternity leave and maternity pay. So it's all a bit of a learning process for us. Yes. Actually, I found some pictures of these early days.
Oh, no.
So I don't know if you remember, this is a photograph. Let's see if I can make this work. With luck, you're seeing a photograph. This is the research group shortly after you arrived, and there you are in your very modest corner of the photograph. Oh, yeah. So I guess this was actually 2002. So it was just before you went back to Cairo for the summer, actually. And then I have another photograph from 3 years later. Group's a bit larger. You're here. Your mum's here. Actually, your dad's in the back, and Whale, I think. And of course, Jana here in the front row. So, and you can see by then we had, well, quite a lot of other young children had popped up into the group. And there's Carol over on the left-hand side. And actually, interestingly, the whole work on emotional computers had developed a bit by here, because we had people working on speech, Tal Schickler, and on body posture and gesture, which was Daniel Bernhardt was leading, and so on. And of course, I think, sorry, yes?
No, go ahead.
I think this photograph was actually taken sort of at about the time of your graduation. So here you are, Whale and Jana, who as ever went with you to the graduation. And if I remember rightly, it was then a year later, this work was so exciting, we actually got invited to present it at a summer science exhibition at the Royal Society in London. And we duly went down. The Royal Society, for people who don't know, it's terribly formal. So there we are in our evening dress with your best evening hijab on and our display. So we had computers. We were actually demonstrating the mind-reading software, analyzing people's emotions. I wish I had a photograph of this, and I don't. I remember the night before it opened, you were sitting in a corner of the room trying to get the program working, actually. But
sounds about right.
Times never were your strong point. But most of the time we were pretty busy, although you did do a television interview. And it turns out, thanks to the wonders of digital video, I can even share that with you. Do you remember this?
Not really. No.
You're right.
Well, there are a number of different applications of our research. The first is to get computers to be emotionally aware and respond in a socially intelligent way to its users, so that human-computer interaction becomes more intelligent and more satisfying. And so we're putting this onto robotic platforms, desktop machines. So that's one sort of application. The other is trying to build wearable technologies to help people with autism learn about emotions and facial expressions. Because in a sense, technology is oblivious of users' mental states in the same way people with autism are sort of mind blind or blind to these nonverbal cues.
Wait, I had a British accent.
You don't, or you? So the background of this picture is interesting. Apart from the slightly creepy guy over on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a picture on our display of Ros Pickard, with whom, of course, you then went to work. So I made the mistake, I think, of inviting Ros to examine your PhD, and she not only passed it with flying colours, but then immediately hijacked you off to MIT for a while, and a whole new story developed.
Sorry. But before we go there, I've always been really curious. I mean, you've seen a lot of technology and evolution of technology, and especially in this human-machine interface space. What did you think of my research proposal, and how did that then spur a lot of research around emotionally intelligent machines? I always thought you were very skeptical in the early days. At least that was my perception.
I think properly so. It was obviously a very new field then. Ross had published her book 3 years earlier, so I mean, it was a bit speculative, and a lot of the early work had been more anecdotal than scientific. So I was nervous about actually getting scientifically valid results rather than just saying this would be a good idea. But like I say, I've always had this policy of recruiting really bright students and then letting them get on with what they want to do. And turned out to be quite a good idea, I think.
I mean, I also remember you challenging me really hard to build something demoable, right? Because when you reduce it to practice, that's when you have to think about the constraints. And so to be able to leverage a webcam, which at the time was, you know, this technology was really big and blurred. This was even prior to smartphones, right? So we had to figure out like all the computer vision. We have to figure out how to do that in real time so that people can see the feedback in real time. So there were a lot of technological challenges in addition to kind of proving the concept that it was doable.
Well, that's true, and of course, your research for the PhD was almost entirely done, as it were, batch-oriented, using this fabulous DVD from Simon Baron-Cohen, which actually was, from a machine learning point of view, was training data to kill for.
Absolutely.
It actually wasn't terrifically good for autism, but Simon found better ways of dealing with that later. And then for the exhibition, we thought it would be a good idea to have a live demonstration. So that's why you were coding the night before. And yeah, I mean, now of course it runs routinely on smartphones. But there again, one of the other things I've learned over the years is Moore's law is real. And a good way of doing research is to buy your way into the future. So you spend a lot of money on things like, in those days, cameras and processing, and just assume that in 10 years' time, it'll be a commodity component, and more or less it works.
Yeah, I also think the commitment to disseminating our research to the public was something I've definitely learned from you, like the summer science exhibition, and just always engaging with the public to kind of evangelize and paint a picture of what the world would look like with this technology. I feel like that's something that you really underscore. You know, I could have easily spent all 3 years in my office just coding away, but you were adamant that we share this with the world.
I think, yes, I mean, of course, you remember one of my colleagues, Alan Blackwell, who told me that we shouldn't, if we're working on human-computer interaction, to think of a technology first and then look for a solution isn't what we do. We've got to think about the people from day one. And I think that's been very helpful, always keeping real people in mind and how they can benefit from it in the future. So yeah, that's certainly been good.
And then you asked about MIT, right? So.
Oh, well, MIT, yes, demo or die is the way they do it. They're a bit harsher on it. Yes, I do it.
Right.
I have to say, this particular area of computer science, apart from being very visual, so it's good for videos and demos, has also been great for reaching out to school students, and particularly women, to whom I think the slightly softer side of human interaction appeals more. And we've noticed that we've used this a lot in our outreach to schools. And it does seem that we're now getting, I was going to say more women studying. We're over 25% this year. I think we're almost at 30%. That's an appallingly low figure, you might think, but it's a lot better than it used to be.
There's actually a comment from Amanda. Hi, Amanda. She says, when I was at Cambridge in the 1970s, I was one of the few PhD candidates there too. Hope the numbers are rising. I guess they are, right?
Oh yes, goodness. Yeah, I mean, we're at about 30% now, I guess. Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But I remember also one of the other things you did do early on, one of the summers when you were back in Cairo with Rana, was you thought it would be interesting to collect some data of people in real life situations. And of course, a lot of the work we'd done up to then was with acted data. So by the simple expedient of balancing a home movie camera on the dashboard of your car, I think you recorded videos as you drove around Cairo while speaking on the phone. I probably shouldn't show this for terribly long because I have a suspicion that it wasn't terrifically legal there either. But it did mean that, yep, it looked like monitoring car drivers might be an interesting route, and I'm delighted to see that that's actually come good, I think, over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was work we kind of did on behalf of a Japanese, top Japanese automaker. And the key question back then was like, do people even exhibit any interesting behaviors when they're driving? And so I was like, okay, I'll try this driving around Cairo. And we were able to get a wide gamut of expressions, everything from distraction to anger to joy. And we were able to demonstrate the idea that you could do this in a car. And then fast forward, 16, 17 years now at Affectiva, my company, that's one of our primary focus areas. And we work with these automakers to bring the technology to the cabin of a car, not just focus on the driver, but also you can detect child seat and children in the vehicle now too, and other occupants, and hopefully personalize the experience. So it's I find it so fascinating, the timeline with which all of this innovation unfolds. I feel like you talked about one of your students inventing the webcam many, many years ago. And here we are now, like finally using webcams in our day-to-day communications. Took a pandemic to make this happen. But again, with automotive, you and I talked about that. We did this initial proof of concept work. And now, 15 years later, that's when the car industry really is commercializing.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that to be said, with the webcam, you know why we did the webcam. It's because our offices in those days were on the 7th floor of a building, and the coffee machine was on the 2nd floor. And we didn't like going down 5 flights of stairs to find there was no coffee. So we pointed one of these new, rather expensive cameras that we'd got connected up to a digitizer, and put the picture onto the web so that we could see when there was fresh coffee. And Quentin Stafford Fraser, who did this, just knocked it up one afternoon when he was bored. So we didn't patent it, which probably the story of my life. I'm not business oriented. Some of my students are more clued up about that, I think I have to say. I think maybe the car stuff, yes, we were just a little bit early with it perhaps, but it's getting there. And I think also it's perhaps the need is bigger now. The roads are busier, the cars are more complicated, the technology in the modern car, the stuff that it's throwing at you. So you're driving through an unfamiliar city centre, lots of traffic, late for a meeting, you're lost. The last thing you need is a satellite navigation system that tells you to make a U-turn. It should actually watch your face, see that you're concentrating, confused, and actually remove distractions, not add to them. But it's going to be good when we actually get this to work.
Yeah, and the broader vision here is that this is going to be ubiquitous. It's not just going to be in your cars. It's going to be the de facto human-machine interface, be it your phone, your Alexa at home, or your social robot. And what I still find really exciting and fascinating about the technology is the sheer amount of use cases and applications of where this can go. And again, this is something we talked a lot about at Cambridge. We kind of pictured what the future would look like. And now I feel like the markets are ready to incorporate these technologies.
Yes, although I have to say, whenever maybe I'm just not very good at this, when I try and speculate about what the future looks like, it's never really got there, because some bright students turned up with a better idea, and that's what we've ended up doing. So I'm just, I don't know that we can plan the future that well, really. It's just, we have to see it as it comes, and just keep on getting the bright students in to see what happens.
There's a couple of interesting kind of questions that build on what we're talking about. Hello, I've come on the Zoom blind as I like the sound of your work. I'm a writer fascinated by the intersection of emotion and technology. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your book and the core ideas within?
Go for it.
So the book's called Girl Decoded, and it's a memoir. And basically, it was written for a broad audience, and it's a juxtaposition of my personal journey, you know, growing up in the Middle East, attending Cambridge, and then coming to MIT as a postdoc, and then eventually spinning out Affectiva to commercialize this technology. But it also, in parallel, follows the path of the technology. Like, how do you build emotion AI? What are the different applications of it? And then, of course, what are the ethical considerations and the moral implications of having technology like this? And I really wanted to engage the general public, both to get people excited about the potential of this technology, but also to be perfectly honest, like upfront about where this can go wrong, and hopefully spark a conversation around what can we do to protect society against what can go wrong. So Peter, I guess I'd love to ask you, like, how do you think about the role of academia in kind of ensuring the ethical development and deployment of these kinds of technologies?
Yes, yeah. Well, I guess in our undergraduate course at Cambridge, we actually teach ethics from the first year. So the freshman year, they get taught ethics. And actually, when the course was first introduced, which was back in the late 1980s, I guess, we actually had it taught by a professional philosopher who I think can address these issues probably rather better than computer scientists. So yes, we try and encourage our students to know that there are bigger issues than just getting the technology going. There are people involved, there are ethical questions, and that's again the sort of thing that comes out from those conversations you have over supper in college in Cambridge, because you will be talking with people who aren't geeks, and they will ask the difficult questions, which is really good, I think, for this sort of thing. So yes, although interestingly, recently, I mean, some of the work I've been doing has, we've gone on with other modes, of course, and we've looked at non-verbal aspects of speech, which I know you're interested in looking at as well now. Body posture and gesture, physiological measurement. And of course, I had a project, I think after you were sort of fully into Affectiva, Ros and I did this project on trying to monitor long-term monitoring of people with mental health conditions through physiological measurement. And that seems as if it could have a lot of value in anticipating depressive episodes and actually getting help in time. And actually, in the current climate, that could be extremely important. We don't unfortunately have the technology ready. And one of the other things that we did that was rather fun was we thought it would be a good idea to see if computers could express emotions. So we had this robotic head built, which has amazingly good prosthetics. It is very, there's Andrew Adams wiring the motors up in the back of the head. But as soon as he moves, you know there's something wrong. People are very good at detecting things wrong with machines. And in fact, this has been a very expensive piece of equipment and virtually useless scientifically. There's very little you can do with this, but it is great for publicity.
Yeah.
People are fascinated with robots. So we even got to appear on a chat show on Spanish national television. So there's a presenter there, and we've just programmed the robot to imitate his facial expressions. Actually, when we said we were going to do this, one of my students said, so you're going to take an experimental face tracker and an unreliable robot on live television. What could possibly go wrong? I said, well, it's in Spain. No one's going to know about it. Actually, it worked perfectly. It was huge fun. But that's the only thing they're good for, is actually publicity. And robots are good for publicity, but I'm not convinced they're terrifically useful for much else, actually. The other thing that we've done much more interesting is actually another very bright Egyptian student from the American university came over and thought it would be fun to look at animal expression. So we've also been looking at, well, sheep, mainly because we've got a lot of sheep in the field opposite the new computer laboratory building. And it turns out, with some colleagues in the vet school this time, rather than psychology, we have a system that actually allows you to detect pain in sheep, which is kind of fun. So here you see a flock of sheep being asked to pose for a photograph. Exercise for the reader. How do you get a flock of sheep to pose for a photograph? Answer, shape a paper bag full of their food and they will almost all look at you, although it turns out, like all group photographs, there's one or two who will face the wrong way just for the fun of it. Anyway, this actually analyzes their facial expressions, and it picked out two that it thought were in pain, and it turned out it was right. Those are the ones that had something wrong with their feet and were actually in pain. So there are some interesting things we can do with that too. So yes,
killer app. That's probably what my affectiva should pivot to doing, like animal emotion detection, right? Like your cat emotion detector. That's there's a business there.
I think animal welfare, isn't it? I mean, I think the health applications for humans are a really big one, and one that we've not really made much progress with yet. There's a long way to go with that. And I think animal welfare, likewise, so that
I want to comment on that. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
I want to build on the mental health applications of this technology, because I do believe there's huge potential there. We already know from research that's been done in academia that there are facial and vocal biomarkers of anxiety, depression. We collaborated with this 15-year-old high school student who had a theory that she could use our technology to through the early diagnosis of Parkinson's patients, and she's now at Stanford and has a research initiative funded to really scale this. So I really, and the fact that we are sitting in front of our technology and our devices all the time, like the data can be there. It's a matter of figuring out how to train these classifiers and then deploy them at scale in a way that
well, and of course, as with all machine learning, the difficult issue is getting reliably labeled training data, which is, I think, something you've been able to do in affectiva in a way that, dare I say it, most academics can't afford to do.
Yeah, we now have, we're almost at 10 million face videos from 90 countries around the world. It's all collected with people's opt-in and consent, but it's about 5 billion facial frames. And of course, we have our own data annotation team, but we've annotated probably less than 5% of all of this data. So
yes, yeah. And of course, if they're car drivers, and many of them are, most of the time, as we discovered, they have totally neutral facial expressions, so they're not actually terribly interesting to look at anyway. Look, we did some experiments. I don't know if you see the ones that we did with some people that we were trying to get tired so we could actually watch them falling asleep. Now, we didn't do this in real cars. We just had them in a simulator, deprived them of sleep for 24 hours, and then made them drive. Ethics, we get ethical approval for this, but that's okay. And it is very interesting watching somebody fall asleep while driving. Some salutary and actually quite easy to detect. So that's something that I think quite a few cars actually have built into them now, that sort of detection.
Right. So we have a lot of questions. Okay.
Oh, yeah, yes. It's so much more fun talking. Oh, no, sorry, that's...
Newnham asks, what if I'm wearing a mask? What is the impact on your research? We've had to retrain or all our classifiers, basically with examples of people wearing the mask. And what we are finding is a lot of the expressions involve, like when you smile, for instance, if it's a true smile, lip corners or your mouth movement, you actually activate the upper muscles in your face as well, like the crow feet wrinkles, like if you're really, so for a lot of the expressions, it involves both the upper and the lower face. But of course it does make it a little bit more challenging.
Well, and of course, Simon Baron-Cohen, in his study of emotional expression, says that about half the expression is just in the eyes. So if you can still see the eyes, you've got quite a lot to read on anyway. Yes, yeah. And I think actually I'd say more than that, he was only looking at facial expressions. In truth, for some of the things that we were looking at originally to do with computer interaction, so agreeing and disagreeing and so on, actually it's the head gesture. Right. And you pick that up independently of, you know, mask out the entire face and you can still see it.
Exactly. Absolutely. Okay. Mark asks, how much of your research was on human emotion versus technology? And can you please say more about affectiva? Human emotion versus technology. So I'm a computer scientist by background, and I actually remember early on in my PhD, I was starting to spend more and more time in the psychology department because I was immersing myself in the science of human emotions and human expressions. And Peter, you called me out one day. You were like, why am I not seeing you in the lab a lot? Like, where are you? But I think it's this interdisciplinary that research that I found so fascinating, being able to draw from the autism research and the psychology of human emotions and then figure out a way to automate that using algorithms and machine learning. I still think this is where innovation happens, at these intersection of disciplines.
Of course, there are a lot of questions. Yes. So ethical questions. Well, I mean, yes, we're monitoring people, but people are monitored anyway. I remember way back, she's on the advantage of being terribly old and in a computer science department's been around for a long time. Back in the 1980s, we were tracking movements of people around our building. We had a technology that did that. And people said, isn't that a terrible invasion of privacy? And we just pointed out, well, that's what happens to them when they use their credit cards. Somebody knows a lot more about them than we knew. And so this has always been there. And it's just important that there's nothing particular about this technology that brings new ethical issues. The ethical issues are there, and they're just always the ones that actually any profession has, which is what is the motivation of the people doing it, and what is their competence. And some people, like some of the social media companies, shall I say, their motivation is weak. They're interested in money, and that's not a good motivation. And they do things to make sure they can make more money. And some of them, dare I say, some of the automated market trading systems, their competence is perhaps slightly to be questioned. And arguably, the 2008 financial crash was caused by people who didn't understand positive feedback in control systems. So I think, yes, there are ethical issues here, but they're the same as for any profession. It's motivation and competence. And we try and turn out graduates who have a bit of an understanding that these are issues they need to know about.
Yeah, and when we spun out of MIT, Roz and I were very adamant that we define a set of core values by which we make business decisions. And so we agreed that we, for example, would enforce opt-in and consent in any work we do. And if people don't have an opportunity to consent, we would not entertain that use case, which of course meant, like, a couple of years later, we got approached by the intelligence, the venture arm of an intelligence agency, and they wanted to give us $40 million or so to pivot the company to focus on security and surveillance and lie detection. And we just felt that that was not in line with our core values, and we did not take the funding. And we routinely get approached by government agencies who want to deploy the technology in this way. And I feel strongly that it's ripe with potential for abuse and discrimination and profiling, but also it doesn't respect people's privacy, because often people don't know that this technology is monitoring.
Yeah. And I think I when I came over to visit you last year,
Last year, yes.
Oh, yeah, I
Oh.
had spent a day with Rose as well and had lunch together, and we were talking about exactly these issues. And she was saying that she is now very cautious about some countries that she is nervous about working with because their governments are likely to use this sort of technology for repressive purposes, monitoring people on the street. Now, actually, I don't think the technology is good enough for that to work yet, but it's certainly not something that we would want to be involved in. So yeah, we stand back from it and don't take the consultancy work that's coming in.
Right. So just to wrap on the data privacy question, Jeffrey's asking, with all this human data, how's data privacy being built into the process? So yeah, for us, it's about like, how do we even deploy the technology? So opt-in and consent is really critical. In a lot of the use cases, like automotive, we don't even store the data. The processing happens on what's called on the edge, so on the chip, basically, and it doesn't leave your car. It doesn't get recorded even. And then in other cases, if it is in, there's all sorts of regulation and data privacy considerations like GDPR practices, which we have to adhere to, and we definitely adhere to because we have clients in Europe and across the world. So I think it's important to prioritize that. Okay,
well,
other
there's a great one
questions?
from David Singer,
Yeah.
which might yet be the Dave Singer that I remember when he was a PhD student in the group, asking on ethics. Is the inference that the system makes still private data, even if we're not entirely sure of it? And actually, that makes a very good point, that we're dealing here with uncertain data. And I think that was one of the things that we really learned with your work. This is not binary computing, not discrete computing. This is probabilistic computing. And so we had to, yeah, we'd be very happy if we got as high as 99% accuracy, I think. But yes, so when you infer that data, how do we label it? Does it still belong to the individual?
Yeah, and do you craft the user experience to incorporate some of this uncertainty, right? And I think that's like really, like in the automotive industry, when we are working with various car manufacturers, if you detect that somebody is tired or falling asleep, do you just alert them? Do you have like a gentle alert? Or do you escalate it?
You don't just sound a siren, so they leap into.
Right. Or even like some car companies we work with have semi-autonomous capabilities, and basically the car will say, you know what, I'm going to take over control because I'll be a safer driver than you are. And we have to kind of consider what the user experience is like, and what if the algorithm was wrong, right? False positive. So it's non-trivial. I
have a fine car that actually does do some, not monitoring of my face, but it does monitor the environment. And if it thinks I'm a line marking out lanes on a freeway, it's actually very good. It does it flashes some lights, and actually it will try and fight me if I try and steer out, unless I indicate first. It's very good at it. It trains you to be a much better driver, because as long as you indicate, it's very happy for you to go. So yes, I think you have to think very hard about how you feed this information back into the system so as not to have
so another kind of related example building on that. So my Jenna, who you saw like in the pictures when she was she's now 17. And so she's starting to drive. And I just keep wishing that there was like a real-time AI coach that would track her level of distraction, her level of anxiety even, and act as a calmer coach than her mom is.
Yes. Well, parents aren't the best driving instructors. I speak from experience. Pay professionals to do it. It makes sense. Yes, I just one last screen share for you, I suppose. So here is your last visit to Cambridge. I think this was 2018, 19, maybe the earlier 2019. So there's you tucked away in the back, Mara in the foreground, and Jana, of course. And Marwa had taken us for an outing, if you remember, onto the roof of King's College Chapel, which was kind of fun.
That was really fun. That was, touring Cambridge for our Jana and one of her friends, which was great.
Oh, yes. So we went up, and I don't know, do you see this picture? So this is the view that we had. It's a great place to admire Cambridge from. You can see all around. Although it turns out quite a long way down. But yes.
Well, I couldn't do that when I was a student, but came back and. All right, more questions. So Fiona has a comment, I guess. When my time in Cambridge from 59 to 62 was just when the first computer course was starting. Unfortunately, I was not in it, but have spent the rest of my work life in IT. Now I'm well retired and in a community of people of the same age. I believe that there is much of all the applications you are talking about that should provide some great support. You are now just talking about some of this. Can you say more about the applications? Yeah, I mean, I know that there's a whole line of work around social robotics and assistive technologies that can help older populations. In particular, we work with various companies in Japan that are bringing this to market. They seem to be really on the bleeding edge of incorporating these technologies at home. And then there's one company called Catalia Health. It's also an MIT spin-out, and they have a robot called Meibu. It's designed to go home with terminally ill patients as they leave the hospital. And at home, it just takes care of you and it monitors your psychological and physiological baseline and engages you in a conversation. And if it feels that as a patient, you know, you're not doing well, it will then escalate that to a human clinician or a human nurse. So that's one use case. Peter, I don't know if you've seen.
Well, yeah, I mean, these are right, but I feel very nervous about these because it seems to me that we're trying to delegate to technology jobs that people actually should be taking on. So it's in some ways, you know, it's very attractive. You know, when my parents getting old, well, I just set up some technology to monitor them and make sure that they're all right. That's not actually the answer. The answer is I take the time off and go and visit them and look after them myself. So I think we have to be very careful about giving up on our responsibilities and just thinking, oh, well, technology will solve it. And I think some of the younger technologists, perhaps they're not quite so close to old age, don't understand this, and they think, I've got a solution, now I'll go and find the problem. And actually, back where we started, you think about the people, and maybe technology isn't the right answer for them. Maybe people are the right answer for them.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think that's one of the key considerations when designing these technologies. One really interesting piece of research that came out of USC was LP Mornsey. I know you know him, Peter. They designed this virtual agent that a virtual therapist essentially that interviews or that's a therapy that works with PTSD patients, and they found that the patients were more forthcoming talking to the therapist than they were talking to a human clinician or a human therapist. And I found that really interesting because they thought the therapist, the virtual one, was less judgmental than the human one. And I just think that says something about us as a humanity.
Well, the same's true actually with even people having preliminary discussions with general practitioners about their conditions. They're more honest if they're just filling in a form on a computer than they are talking to someone face to face. So there is definitely a place for technology here, but it's not a replacement for where personal care. Actually, I see there's an interesting question. Are we getting ready to detect what George Orwell called thought crime? Mm-hmm. And even if affectiva is ethical, which it is, won't other enterprises be less ethical? And I think, yep, I'm afraid the answer is there will be unethical use of this. There's unethical use of most technologies. I think one of the things we can do here is to educate people to be aware that this might be being used. As I feel a lot of, well, now I think we've gone through the social media, the initial bubble, and now actually children at school are being taught about the dangers of indulging in these things and committing too much information to them. So yeah, we just got to keep on educating people to be aware of what companies will be doing.
Yeah, and I also, this is one reason I wrote the book. I really think the consumers, like all of us, have a real say in this. We can vote with our feet, right? Like, so if we are able to say, well, this company adheres to the ethical guidelines in building their AI, but this company doesn't. So we're not going to use this other company. I think that, consumers can vote with their feet. So I feel like that's really
I'd
okay.
like
So Mark,
to say that was the case, but I do have at the back of my mind that in some countries you don't get that choice. So you have to use your smartphone to earn social credit points by answering quiz questions that show your approval of the government. And if the phone's monitoring your facial expression and can see that you aren't terribly serious while you're giving the right answers, that is seriously worrying, which is one of the reasons why there are some countries we no longer do work with. Yeah, they will get there. There will always be wicked people in the world. I'm afraid we do live in a fallen world, and that is a problem.
Yeah, our two biggest competitors are Chinese companies, and we definitely.
I was trying not to name any particular
country. Well,
country, but yes, of course, that is the one.
I think we may be running out of
time. Towards getting the end. Did you want to say something about cultures? I remember that was something that we learned fairly early on. And actually, it was one of the great things that going to the Royal Society exhibition. I think we had 2,000 people try the system there, which was the biggest trial we'd ever done. We'd done about half a dozen previously. And it was essentially worked for all but about 2 of them, I think. And actually, one thing that we did see, at least with that system, was there was a pretty good cross-cultural portability. But you've got much more data now. So how's the cultural sensitivity showing up?
Yeah, we now train it based on data from, as I said, 90 countries around the world. It's kind of interesting. We found that, for example, there are gender differences in how people express emotions. Women tend to show more positive expressions. They tend to smile longer and more, but it depends on where you are. So in the US, we found that women smile 40% more than men do. In France and Germany, it was 25%. And then get this, in the UK, there was no statistically significant difference between men and women. And I will not comment on the intensity of the expressions in the first place. But we are now able to do this at scale, and it's really fascinating. We also found that collectivist cultures versus individualistic cultures, like in Asia, there tends to be a reluctance to share true expressions, especially in the presence of strangers.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember that from when we were doing the car work in Japan. We thought one important thing to detect would be anger in a driver, and we couldn't understand why there was no interest in that. And eventually someone pointed out to me that Japanese culture, it's rude to display anger. So we had to call it discomfort instead. And then it was a useful thing to detect. And if the driver was discomforted, then we possibly needed to intervene. So yes, there are cultural differences. I think they're more ones of intensity than than the actual. And of course, this goes back to the studies that Darwin did back in the 19th century, which I guess underpins some of this work, and then which Paul Ekman revisited in the 60s and 70s, which really led to the growth of the work that we're seeing now when we've tried to automate the work that these people did earlier.
Can we wrap up with quickly? I've seen kind of threads of this in the questions, the applications in video conferencing and telehealth and education, because that's something I'm very like right now. If we were all in person, we would, Peter and I would see the level of engagement of the audience, and we would be able to, right? Yeah. Like we would be able to adapt in real time. It's so hard to do that, but with this kind of technology, you can quantify level of attention, positivity, engagement, and that has applications in how we connect with each other, be it professionally or in an educational context. So Peter, are you thinking about this? We're definitely thinking about this.
Yes, so I had a couple of students look at online teaching systems so that we could actually see if I mean, just exactly those mental states that you considered way back. So interested, bored, understanding, confused. And the trouble is that there is collecting data from online students was just difficult then. Now, actually, we have a lot more data available because a lot of us are teaching online. there's also the slight problem that the students do tend to turn their cameras off, actually. We're having to learn to insist that they keep their cameras on. So if I'm doing a small group class with 2 or 3 people, if they turn their cameras off, it is unbelievably difficult to teach. So yes, that does emphasize the point that we do need that feedback just to see what's going on. Even computer scientists need it. Of course, computer scientists aren't terribly good at reading mental states. You know, the extrovert computer scientist is the one who looks at your feet rather than his own when he's talking to you. And to learn to look at faces more. All right, that's a good question. Yes. Oh dear, we're going to get cut off soon.
I think we're gonna, yeah.
Do we ever have an emotional meltdown when it comes with technology? Yep, you should hear me yelling at Alexa when she doesn't shut up when I tell her to shush, please. Actually, I do say shush. My wife thinks this is hugely funny. And then she yells, shut up, and Alexa shuts up. How are you with technology?
I do get frustrated with our technology for sure. The one thing I want is my fridge to basically stop me from binge eating when I'm stressed. And just basically lock down and say you've had enough ice cream. That's my my pet peeve. All right, I think we're gonna get. So one question: can we follow up with you with further questions? And if so, what's the best way? Thank you. So Peter, what's the best way to get hold of you and I can share?
Well, I mean, Google search for Peter Robinson Cambridge will find me, and email will reach me. That's fine. It would be nice if we could share any of the questions with a wider audience. And at that point, I'm a bit stuck for technology. I'm not quite sure what the right thing is.
Maybe team.
How would you address this sort of thing publicly?
Well, so I'm very easy to find on social media, like on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I love to hear from everybody. So if you want to follow up, please reach out. I'm also Rana at affectiva.com, so I'm pretty easy to find. I think if the team, our hosts, want to compile these questions, and we can take a stab at answering them, and we can disseminate them. You know, I don't know. There's definitely a lot of really, really interesting questions here.
So I think our host said that this talk was going to get put on the Cambridge in America YouTube channel. So presumably there's a mechanism there for adding comments, and we might keep an eye on it and try and answer some questions if they turn up there. I'm just trying to think how we can make it available to more people. But, yeah.
Right.
Well, if they're not cutting us off, we'll carry on talking. So Dave Singer's back actually asking about deception, and I think deception is very difficult to detect. I think a lot of the evidence of computer systems are anecdotal, and the best way to do it is to actually interview people. So if you've been through security systems, actually the really thorough ones, and that has to be said, Israel are probably some of the most thorough in this, you are interviewed and somebody just keeps asking you a lot of questions, and they can tell if the flow of your answers is genuine. And it turns out that most technologies for lie detection have an accuracy of about as good as tossing a coin. But the people who've been trained, particularly the people, dare I say it, who work for the security services, are much better at it. And they actually know how to read these things in people's faces. So, and I think the mismatch between what they're saying,
right, and what they're
and what's going on.
So Amanda had a question. Just quickly, she had a question on the book. So there is the paperback version, but there's also an ebook, and I narrated it. So if you're into audiobooks, you can look into that too. The paperback doesn't come out for another. It comes out next April. So
we shall look forward. Well, Rana, lovely talking to you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Cambridge in America.
Thank you, Rana and Peter, for continuing the dialogue around technology and emotions that you began in Cambridge 20 years ago, today with Cambridge alumni and friends across North America. To those who have joined us for this conversation, if you are interested in reading more about Rana and Peter's work and the progress made in Emotion AI, you can purchase a copy of Rana's book, Girl Decoded, at girldecoded.ai. On behalf of Cambridge in America, thank you all for joining us today and for being vital members of our Cambridge community. For more information about the work Cambridge in America is doing, please visit cantab.org. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. We look forward to continuing to connect with you, for now in a digital capacity, and hope to see you at future events. Thank you.